Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite the star of the show, Fuad Akhundov, who is very humble, but I have to mention that he's one of the best researchers of history and architecture in Azerbaijan. He traveled all the way from Azerbaijan to Israel in order to be here with us at this event. Fuad, madam, the floor is yours.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my particular honor and pleasure to address such an esteemed audience in a place that I could not imagine a better one for the topic that we're going to discuss today. ANU Museum of the Jewish People, a wonderful venue that gathered us all together to delve into one of the most miraculous and mysterious kind of pockets of Jewish culture that happens to be in my native Azerbaijan. So what makes me particularly proud of being Azerbaijani is that I represent a country that has the only old Jewish settlement outside Israel that has been known as a place as Jerusalem of the Caucasus. A tiny mountainous area, beautiful like Canaan, bisected by a river. The town of Kuba had been mentioned as the place for Jewish settlement centuries ago. Distinguished ambassador mentioned the anniversary of 290 years, but he was absolutely right to say that the Jewish history of Azerbaijan predates this figure by good 10 times, because it's one of the endemic ethnic groups, one of the unique kind of, pockets of Jewish culture which has its own language, which has its very specific traditions. In case of Kuba, you can even speak about very site-specific architecture that we're going to speak about, yet it always managed to retain its Jewish identity, which was shaped by the environment it has been living in for centuries, but never led to assimilation. That's what makes Kuba and Azerbaijan particularly fabulous. A town bisected by a river that was called Jordan of the Caucasus, where on one bank you have a mosque, whereas on the other bank you have a dozen of synagogues. A place that was described by Alexander Dumas in his Voyage au Caucase back in 1858, and a place that has an absolutely magnificent story of its own. The history of mountain Jews is so ancient that to this very day there are no clear kind of opinion about the origin, the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, particularly Bnei Ephraim, one of the versions which has a right to exist but still needs a lot of research to be supported, and we'll accept that. Well, it really shows that it's a very, very old cultural pocket. The other origin links the mountain Jews or the Caucasian Jews to the famous kingdom of Khazaria or Khazar Khaganate, which was existing since 650 to 969 AD, and you can see the vast territories the Khazar Khaganate was occupying in the heyday of its prosperity, yet the elite of Khazars were professing Judaism. They adopted Judaism in about 740, but here we deal with the issue of chicken and egg. Were the mountain Jews the descendants of Khazar, or was the adoption of Judaism by Khazars influenced by the mountain Jews? The mountain Jewish history of the Caucasus in general and Azerbaijan in particular predates the Khazar Khaganate. So here we deal with the cause and effect issue. And the third, the most prevalent kind of theory explaining the origin of the mountain Jews in the Caucasus still goes back to very old times, which is Babylon captivity, Galut Babel. Babylon captivity that leads to the destruction of the first temple, but then you have King Cyprus, 538 BC, who conquered Babylon and who kind of liberated Jews and brought them to Persia, and they settled around Ecbatana, Hamadan. Well, part of them would return back, the others would stay in Persia, yet the situation would change in Persia itself under Sasanians, particularly during the period of Yezdigal II. We're speaking of 440 to 458 AD. There were some kind of religious purges while the Sasanians were enforcing Zoroastrianism, and that made the situation of Jews in Persia a little bit tricky. So that was the time when the Jews started moving up north of Persia, as far as you can get, and they were settling in the northernmost edges of what used to be the Persian Empire, which led them to places like Derbent, to places like, well, we're past the greater Caucasus mountain chain. They were less accessible to the Persian rulers, yet it brought them to a completely different environment where each settlement, each village, was a kind of state of its own. And there was a very interesting researcher of the mountain Jewish history, Felix Shapiro, that found a very interesting manuscript which was held by a rabbi of Petrovsk, that was the old name of Makhachkala, which now is the capital of Dagestan, which tried to tell the history of the migration of the Jews to the Caucasus, a kind of exodus, Jewish exodus to the Caucasus from Persian Empire, which could be another interesting area to study, Jewish studies. So what he read in that manuscript was just the way our ancestors, having left Egypt, and had been wandering 40 years, crossed the Red Sea and Jordan, and ended up in Canaan, and erected the Holy Temple to then live happily in a country abundant with milk and honey. We did travel a lot, crossing rivers and seas to find our last abode in the land of mountains reaching the sky. And here did we build the house of Lord. According to Felix Shapiro, the owner of this manuscript, referring to his ancestors, was claiming that the land they found their last abode was Kuba. And the place where they built the house of Lord was the museum in the neighborhood of Kulkati in Kuba. And interestingly enough, so many centuries after, this synagogue today is housing the world's first museum of history and culture of mountain Jews. Isn't that something? Isn't that a jewel any country really can be proud of? And the links, the historic links, are far not a coincidence. So many years after, this completely restored synagogue in the neighborhood of Kulkati in Kuba is housing the world's first museum of mountain Jews. That is something that makes me proud of being Azerbaijani, for this unique Jewish culture that is preserved and cherished in my country. But you may ask, well, why is it Kuba? Interestingly enough, when the when the Jews coming from Persia were getting past the great Caucasus mountain range, well, they were less accessible to the Persian rulers, but as I told you, they found themselves in a completely different environment where geography, well, shapes a totally different lifestyle. Highland areas. Well, quite an obstructed access to each place where each village is something of its own. So they had to pick up the lifestyle typical of Caucasian nations. Accomplished horse riders, agriculturalists, orcharders. So in a couple of centuries after the Jewish migration to the Caucasus, you really could hardly see the difference, well, superficially, in between a Jew and an Azeri, and a Lezgi, and an Avar, the type of dress, the lifestyle, polygamy, well, this kind of code of honor and everything, it was commonly shared. Yet there was one thing that made a huge difference, which was religion. The religion was retained. And here are the two issues of adaptation and assimilation. And if you ask me, was there an adaptation of mountain Jews to the new environment? Yes, there was. And it would be these horse riders, these fighters from the Caucasus that would provide the guardianship to the kibbutzes in Israel in the early days of the formation of the state of Israel, because they had this tradition behind them. And they were drafted to Russian army at the times when other Jews were not. So they will play their role here in Israel, but was there assimilation? The answer is no. So adaptation and assimilation are two different things. So while the mountain Jews were very much adapted to the environment they were living in, they retained their identity through the religion. And that, of course, makes a great credit to both the mountain Jews and the environment that gave them an opportunity to remain who they were, becoming a part and parcel of this very ethnically and culturally diverse region as the Caucasus. So they retained their traditions, they retained their lifestyle. Meanwhile, look at this young man who looks so Caucasian. So he was Caucasian by shape, but Jewish in content, which was not the luxury the Jews could afford in other parts of the world. The Caucasus gave this chance. But still, well, by early 20th century, we have a huge number of Jewish settlements scattered all over the Caucasus. Look, all these red dots were the places with Jewish settlements, and they started from Auguz, they started from Goychay, they started from Shamachi, which is Azerbaijan today, and they ended up all the way to Grozny, Vladikavkaz, Nalchik, Mozdok. So the mountain Jewish settlements were scattered all over the Caucasus, and the Jews were an integral part of the Caucasian population over time. Yet, if you ask me what happened to these settlements today, Azerbaijan's Kuba is the only place that managed to preserve its Jewish population. And you would say, why Kuba? Was it the oldest settlement in the Caucasus? No. Was it the largest settlement in the Caucasus? No, either. Well, if you track the history of Jewish settlers, you know the memories of the first rabbi in the Caucasus, Rabbi Safra at-Derbandi, can be found in the Jerusalem Talmud, and they date back to the 4th century. 4th century AD. So Derbent used to be the oldest settlement for Jews, but what makes Kuba so special? And here we have to get the overall historic context of not very ancient times, but times pretty much interesting. We're speaking of the second half of the 18th century. Look, the whole area of the Caucasus was kind of dominated by Persia. But Persian influence was getting weak and weak, disputed by Ottoman Turkey. But neither Ottoman Turkey nor Persia could prevail, and these permanent wars in between the two inevitably brought about the third actor, which is Russia. So the first attempts of Russians to take over the region date back to the early 18th century, when Peter I made his foray, made a campaign from Derbent all the way down to Persia. In 1723, he captured the citadel of Baku, and in Baku there is a joke. Why is Peter I? Because he was the first to get Baku. And why is Catherine II? Because she was the second to get Baku. But both Peter I and Catherine II died immediately after getting Baku. That was not a happy thing for them. But when Peter the Great died, well, there was a moment when his successors were not in a position to control the region. Well, and in Persia, you got a kind of Persian Peter I, or he was called Napoleon of the Orient, Nadir Shah of Persia, who was the last tough ruler who tried to reconquer the area and left a lot of settlements devastated. Azeri, Lezgi, Avarian, Jewish. And when it came to Jews, the difference in religion, well, kind of added to the atrocities. And here we have a legend that is still cherished by the mountain Jews in general and Kuba in particular. It was exactly in 1734, 290 years ago, when the Persian army entered a tiny village of Kusari, which now is in the north of Azerbaijan, and they got into Jewish settlement on the day of Sabbath, when all the men were in synagogue, and when the Persian soldiers rushed into synagogue, and the warrior, well, kind of raised his sword, Rabbi Reuven ben Samuel protected himself. And miraculously, the sword made no harm to Rabbi. And that was the signal to the Persian army. He said, we're not going to make any harm to you. This all happened due to your piety, Rabbi. So the Persians left Kusari. So this kind of case is now cherished. And in the newly opened Museum of Mounted Jews in Kuba, this book that saved the rabbi is going to be kept as one of the #1 and most important exhibits. But after this event, a lot of Jewish settlements were kind of devastated, like many local settlements. But what happened? In 1735, Nader Shah was killed. And like in case of Peter I, his successors were very weak and inefficient. So now it's Persia who was unable to control the region. So from about 1735 all the way to early 19th century, it was a period when Persia was already not able to control the Caucasus, whereas Russia was not there yet. And this interim period of about half a century was the period when the local khans, the local princes, came into the stage. And one of them was the Prince of Kuba, the Khan of Kuba, Fatih Ali Khan, and his father Hussein Ali Khan. So what they started doing, they started inviting the Jews from the areas devastated by Persians to settle the left bank of the river of Kudial-Chai, that nowadays is called Caucasian Jordan. And well, the purpose was simple. They wanted to have taxpayers, they wanted to settle the area, and of course they provided protection to the Jewish population. So that was the reason why the big settlement of mountain Jews appeared on the left bank of the river of Kudial. And for an outsider, the Jewish settlement may seem very monolithic. In fact, before 1926 was the Soviet time, the official name of the place was Еврейская Sloboda, the Jewish settlement. It was the Soviets who would rename it into Red Settlement, Red. Everything was red under the Soviets. Anyways, so it was a Jewish settlement which for outsider could seem very monolithic, very kind of, solid. But if you take a look at it from inside, what you get is an enormous diversity within the settlement, which was divided into 9 neighborhoods, mahalle. And the name of each neighborhood originated from the place where the ancestors of the place used to come. So those who came from Kusar established the neighborhood called Kusori. Those who came from Karchakh, which is Dagestan, established a neighborhood called Karchehi. Kulkat, Kulkoti. There were people coming from Gilan, which is the province of Iran, and they made their settlement called Gilaki. The last settlement was called Mizrahi, coming from the east. In fact, the last settlers came from the eastern part of the river. Unbelievable. They used to come from Iran all the way to this place, and the last settlers would come from the opposite side of the river because they saw a big Jewish settlement, so they made the final, last but not least important neighborhood called Mizrahi. And it had 9 neighborhoods and 13 synagogues. How about that? So it was that unique specificity of the settlement that won Kuba its special name of Jerusalem of the Caucasus. And by early 20th century, good 1/3 of the overall mountain Jewish population of the Caucasus was living in Kuba. And it was the place where all the Jewish traditions were rigorously observed and kept and passed over from generation to another. But it was still quite a secluded area, yet this tradition of living as a separate Jewish settlement developed a lot of local traditions. When by the beginning of the 20th century, you got a local architect, Gilel Ben Chaim, and luckily recently I found his great-grandson in Israel. In fact, it was the other way around. His great-grandson kindly found me and provided me with something I was looking for decades, the portrait of a person who built this magnificent 6-dome synagogue in the area of Karchei. in Kuba, and a bunch of absolutely fabulous buildings that actually shaped the image of the place. So you had a place with its own architecture, with its own traditions, with its own typically Jewish lifestyle, when some neighborhoods had, well, the richest ones, used to have 2 synagogues per neighborhood. Why? Following the old Jewish tradition. This is the synagogue I go to, and this is the synagogue I never go to. But there were synagogues, there were neighborhoods, and each neighborhood had a kind of nickname. So they really had this very Jewish internal life, which was hardly accessible for an outsider, but that was a pocket of Jewish culture that managed to survive different historic periods, both the Russian Empire and the Soviet regime. And it was the period of independent Azerbaijan when, in this area, we ultimately got the unique museum of the history and culture of mountain Jews. But another very important kind of element, well, they kept the Jewish lifestyle, they observed all the traditions, well, and they were very observant of these traditions even in the Soviet time. Well, and in the Soviet time they were just complaining that there is 100% circumcision and all the bridal kind of rites are made under huppah and so on, because Soviets tried to eradicate it, but the Jewish culture managed to survive it. We're going to speak about that later on. But what makes the community in Kuba in general, and particularly in the Caucasus, particularly special, is that, look, the Jewish people scattered all over the world, had different languages. While Hebrew was the language of Torah and religious rites and ceremonies, we know that Ashkenazi Jews had their own language, which is Yiddish, which is generally based on German. While the Sephardic Jews have their own language, which is Ladino, which is generally based on Spanish. Well, the Jews in Georgia, neighboring Georgia, have their own language, which is called Kivruli, which is a kind of dialect of Georgian. And the mountain Jews are far not an exception in this regard. They have their own language. Lingua franca, day-to-day language, used to be called Juhuri, the Jewish language. And what is that? In fact, you can't call it a language per se. The same Felix Shapiro, who was a very, very nice researcher, he was, by the way, the author of the first Hebrew-Russian dictionary. So he was a chief of Talmud Torah in Baku, because Baku was a very attractive place to the Ashkenazi Jews in Russian Empire, because they were really attracted to Baku not only by oil business, where they controlled 11% of all the oil production. They were lured Baku by a very tolerant attitude of Baku to Ashkenazi Jews. And like Ambassador kindly noted, before there were never a Jewish neighborhood in Baku, never a Jewish ghetto in Baku. So there was a sizable Ashkenazi Jewish community in Baku, which counted for 4.5% of the population in 1913, but this 4.5% of the population counted for over 40% of medical doctors and over 30% of lawyers, and there were some scholars among them, and it were these scholars who started seriously studying the history and traditions of mountain Jews. So Felix Shapiro had a very nice work on the mountain Jews, where he tries to give a kind of scientific definition to what Juhuri is. And what he says, this is an Iranian dialect pronounced by Semitic vocal apparatus and based on Turkic harmony, partially phonetically, partially morphologically, and in its syntactic context. This type of dialect could only develop in a country where ethnic groups of Iranian, Semitic, and Turkic origin live side by side, and Azerbaijan is exactly the place of this kind. So Azerbaijan provided the environment where you could have this blend and mix of both Semitic and Persian and Turkic elements developing into a language which should be studied. And I love the mugams, the traditional Azeri musical performances performed in Juhuri. It is so melodic, it is so beautiful. So once again, the issue of adaptation with no assimilation. That's what creates this absolutely unique ethnic pockets. And since the 19th century, well, there were very interesting studies of the mountain Jewish culture. And one of the greatest kind of elements to study is this beautiful Jewish cemeteries, which Kuba is famous for. There are 3 of them. And interestingly enough, they're located in an elevated part of the city. So whenever I go to the Jewish settlement in Kuba, I never go to the settlement itself. I try to drive a little bit up the road leading to Kusari, to the mountains, and you have to start looking at the Jewish settlement from the cemetery, from above, where you can see the Jewish settlement beneath, and then the river of Kudyal-Chai, and then the opposite side. And on the one bank you see the synagogues, on the other bank you see a mosque. It's an absolutely magnificent view. And these cemeteries of Kuban are a very good kind of issue for studies. So there is quite a famous Israeli genealogist, Meir Galevi Gover, who back in 2019 made a trip to the settlement, to the Jewish settlement, to study the graves there. And the graves he described date back from 1756 all the way to 1980s. Absolutely beautiful gravestones that were influenced by various time periods. So whenever I go to this cemetery, I always recall a very beautiful verse by a Russian poet, Vyazemsky. Unfortunately, it's not translated into English so far, but for the Russian-speaking part of the audience, I'd like just to recite a couple of them. The description of this Jewish cemetery in the mountains of the Caucasus. Где б ни был я в краю кавказском, но и никогда не позабыт тот угол светлый и печальный, где тихий ангел погребальный усопших мирный сон хранит. Мне так сочувственны могилы, в земле так много моего увядших благ, ушедшей силы, что мне кладбище берег милый, и мне приветлив вид его. Предавшись думам несказанным, и здесь я на закате дня спешу к местам обетованным, могилам чуждым, безымянным, но не безмолвным для меня. В горах еврейское кладбище так близко к небу вознеслось. Прозрачный воздух был здесь чище, и дней минувших пепелище цветущей жизнью облеклось. So the cemeteries that really bring about the filling of this history, the roots of a settlement that still exists today and constitutes the matter of a particular pride. But the scholars of mountain Jewish history and culture started popping up in the 19th century at the times of Russian Empire. And one of them was Yuda Yakov Chorny. Unfortunately, we don't even have his picture. He was born in Minsk, which now is Belarus. And his parents were winemakers. But he was very fidgety, he was very adventurous. He didn't want to follow the family business, so he came to the Caucasus at the age of 22. And he spent 10 years in the Caucasus, publishing a bunch of interesting articles which he wanted to bring into one book one day, yet his premature death at the age of 45 never made that happen. But he was the first person to try to shed the light into the history of mountain Jews. The next person who was interested in that was Vsevolod Miller. Actually, he was more involved in the Caucasus in general, so he was known for studies of Ossetia and stuff like that, but he was very supportive of the young Jewish, mountain Jewish scholars, and one of his promotees or proteges was a person whom I have a special honor and pleasure to hereby introduce, the first mountain Jewish scholar, Eliyahu Ben Sherbet Nisim Oglu. Look, Ben Sherbet, typically Jewish patronymic, Nisim Oglu, typically Turkish family name. That's the blend of various cultures. Well, he belonged to a very, very kind of respected clan, Ajdoho, the strongman. His grandfather was a scholar and theologist. His father was the closest AD of Imam Shamil, who only gave up to Russians when Imam Shamil actually was captured. But the situation changed. He was given as a student to a school in Temerhan Shura, which now is Buynaksk, Dagestan, and he followed his studies at the Imperial Moscow Technical College. Well, and there he was spotted by Vsevolod Miller. He had technical background. Later on, he would be operating at the oil fields in Balakhane, in Baku. But in 1880s, he was seconded to the Caucasus with a special mission to make what now is called an ethnographical study of the mountain Jews. And the result was an absolutely beautiful book, The Jewish Mountaineers of the Caucasus. Fascinating book. A book who was written by a person who was absolutely fluent in Juhuri, in Russian to write the book, and what is no less important, in Azeri, which was a lingua franca in the Caucasus at that time. And he penned an absolutely marvelous book, which years after is an unbelievably valuable source of ethnographic information. And his overall conclusion is, in general, the mountain Jews enjoyed very friendly relations with the Aborigines. Aborigines are the natives of the Caucasus. Quite often, a mountain Jew forges friendship with his Muslim neighbor, and after a heartfelt kiss, becomes his lifelong friend, Kurdash, Gardash. Yeah, a brother. They exchange their guns and take a holy oath to spare neither pain nor expense, and their very lives for each other's rescue. So that's Eliyahu ben Sherbet. But the Russians knew him as Anisimov, because when he was given to a Russian school, there was a trend to Russify the name. So he was Nisimoglu. So first they cut his Turkic ending, Oglu, the son, replacing it by Russian ending Ov, Nisimov. And then say, no, Nisimov. Why won't you be Anisimov? And Eliyahu ben Sherbet Nisimoglu becomes Ilya Sherbetovich Anisimov. So that was the Russian influence, but nonetheless, the gentleman left an absolutely beautiful ethnographic description of the Caucasus, and that was the first mountain Jewish scholar. And then, very interesting studies were made by Felix Shapiro. In fact, his name was Feitel Lazarovich Shapiro. He was a teacher at Talmud Torah in Baku, but his students kind of couldn't pronounce his name, Feitel. They called him Fayeton. And one nice day, the principal of the school called him and said, look, everything is fine, but you have this, ancient Jewish name, Feitel, but your students have kind of converted it into Fayeton, which is not good. Why won't you become Felix? So Feitel became Felix. Fine. But it was this gentleman who made a lot of trips to the Jewish settlement, and, he came up with this very interesting studies. Later on, under the Soviets, he would be the first editor of Hebrew-Russian major academicians, major scholars, who would dedicate a lot of efforts to studying the history and culture of mountain Jews. So, here are some of his, articles, works, and here he is among the students of school in the Jewish settlement of Kuba. So he was one of those really cornerstone scholars who actually studied the history of mountain Jews. But in 1920, a new page of history is opened with the Soviet communist takeover of first Azerbaijan, and then Armenia, and then Georgia, and the Caucasus becomes a part of Soviet Union, which really changed the rules of the game. And that was the moment when the Soviet regime came to the Jewish settlement. And what it led to in 1926, there was no longer Jewish settlement. It was renamed into Red Settlement. You see, Rote village, Rote Fane. The Soviets loved this, red colors and everything. They renamed the settlement, and they tried to change the lifestyle. And there were pros and cons. There are always two sides of the coin. On the one hand, of course, the Soviets were pretty much oppressive of religion, so out of all these numerous synagogues, they will keep only one in the neighborhood of Giloki. The other synagogues would be closed. They tried to assimilate everyone, but after hundreds series of years of living in a very interesting environment and not getting assimilated, the Mountain Jews managed to retain their identity, but in the meantime they had to play the rules of the game. And an interesting thing of the Soviet regime was that they introduced the concept of education. So the girls started going to school, and the Soviets tried to their very best to overcome this traditionally secluded lifestyle of the Mountain Jews to kind of better integrate them into the life of the society. And that was the time when a lot of youth from the Jewish settlements started coming to Baku. So the concept of so-called Jewish neighborhoods in Baku appeared with the Mountain Jews. Why? Because when one person was coming to Baku and getting settled there, well, his cousins, his brothers, his relatives used to come and settle nearby. So there was no concept of ghetto, but there were neighborhoods with sort of dominant mountain Jewish population because they were used to this clustered lifestyle. So there was a pocket of mountain Jewish population in Baku around the synagogue for mountain Jews in the city. But that was the time when you got a number of scholars from among the mountain Jews. And on the other hand, of course, there were purges. Well, the purges that the Soviets had, well, didn't pass the Jewish settlement. And here is a very tragic story of the famous Rabbi Elizar ben Evdon, well, from the Red Settlement, who actually was arrested by the Soviets, and then he was exiled to Ashgabat, to Turkmenistan, well, and there a person who was a rabbi, well, he was kind of demoted to the level of Shoichet, and then Moel, and then Melamed. So they tried ultimately, well, he became a cobbler there in exile, but even that didn't save him. The Soviets ultimately executed him. And the story of one rabbi from Kuba is very indicative of the Soviet attitude to religion in general. And unfortunately, well, Judaism was not an exception. But even despite this purges and suppression of all the religious structures, well, the Jewish traditions kept living under the Soviet time. And it made the Soviets crazy, but still, no matter how they tried, there was 100% circumcision on the 8th day, and all the wedding ceremonies were made under chuppah, and the Soviets couldn't understand. The members of Komsomol, Young Communist League, are still using chuppah, but the answer was, otherwise the Jewish mothers will never give their daughters. So it were the Jewish mothers in the Red Settlement that kept the Jewish traditions, and in a way that really gave a chance to the Mountain Jews to retain their ethnic and cultural identity in a totally different setting of the Soviet time, but within Azerbaijan. And, well, in the meantime, by the same token, a lot of Jewish people got integrated and involved in educational processes, and you would have a Soviet time Mountain Jewish scholar. In the times of Russian Empire, you had Eliyahu Ben Sherbet Nisim Oglu. Well, in the Soviet time, you had another gentleman with a background in oil studies, Yakov Mikhailovich Agaronov. Well, in fact, he was an oil worker. At the times of World War II, he was one of the key figures to establish the second Baku, because the Soviets were fearful that the Germans may get Baku. Luckily, they never did that. So they were building the second Baku in Kuibyshev, in the Volga. So he was one of the key figures in making kind of outlet of Baku over there in Russia, a well-trained oil worker. But in the meantime, he was a party activist, Communist Party activist. He was the chief of the Raikom, the Regional Communist Party Committee of one of the most industrial areas of Baku, Surakhane, Balakhane, Sabunchi. Yet, he was very much dedicated to his kind of settlement. And he was the one who would write a very interesting book, A Great Destiny of a Small Nation. And apart from studying the history of Mountain Jews, of course, his studies were influenced by the Soviet regime, which he was a product of. You couldn't leave outside of your context, but what makes him particularly special, he was one of the promoters of Jewry. And Felix Shapiro was the author of the Hebrew-Russian dictionary, Yaakov Agaronov was the author of the Dictionary of the Language of Jewry. And his mission was continued by his son, Mikhail Agaronov, who unfortunately passed away several years ago. So that was the Soviet period of mountain Jewish history, which managed to survive. And now we come to the period of independent Azerbaijan. And that's exactly the period when the Jewish settlement in Kuba got its museum, which is a kind of temple. And you know, interestingly enough, they used one of the oldest synagogues to make a museum in it. And the spirit of synagogue is still there when you enter the museum. And I think it would be a very interesting place to study for ANU, Center of the Jewish People, because they tried to keep the spirit of synagogue with the 12-sitting place, the minyan. They kept Aron HaKadosh and Bima. And museums should have some exhibits, and we know that Judaism and Islam are prohibited with figurative art, so they managed to place their exhibit in the site. So the overall setting and design of the museum does not violate the traditions of synagogue. So the spirit of a holy place still lives in the world's first museum of mountain Jewish culture and history, which now is a must-see place in Kuba, Azerbaijan, and it's really a beautiful place. You know, the old synagogue was so ramshackle, so it was virtually falling apart. They disassembled it, and they reassembled it from the same stone. But by doing that, they managed to make an underfloor where you have a storage for the old books, where you have library, where you have a conference center. So they managed to keep the architecture of the old synagogue, which was designed or redesigned by Gilel Ben Chaim, but they managed to make a totally new content into it. And I think it reverberates too much with the place that we're in now on a smaller scale of the Jewish settlement in Azerbaijan. So, well, in Kuba, they still keep this old heritage buildings like the house of the family of Agha the merchants, and all these houses were designed by Gilel Ben Chaim, whose great-grandson now lives in Israel. But it was this architectural tradition that found its way in the modern-day buildings of Kuba, where you have these palatial buildings, well, and they still are kind of influenced by the old architecture of the Jewish settlement. So it's a new phase, a new life of the Jewish settlement in independent Azerbaijan. And whenever you're there, try to go to a six-dome synagogue where you can see this beautiful Star of David on one bank of the river with the mosque on the other bank. And in today's Parliament of Azerbaijan, we have a member of parliament from the Jewish settlement, Anatoly Rafailov, and the mountain Jews today are the great promoters of Azeri culture. I live between Baku and Canada, so whenever you go to Toronto or New York, and if you ever find an good Azerbaijani restaurant, well, you will always have a mountain Jewish owner of that, because they kind of feel part and parcel of this culture. Yeah, they're Jews, they're very practicing Jews, but in the meantime, they're proud to say that we are Azerbaijani Jews. And by the same token, we Azeris are proud to have this Jewish settlement. And we always said that Azerbaijan's jewelry is Azerbaijan's jewelry. And Kuba is a clear example of that. Thank you for your kind attention.
But also Tel Aviv and Berlinite, so I'd like to get you part. If you're here, I'm the head of the external relations.